has gotten secrets for you to learn and know about. And uh, it's not the most exciting read. It's very technical. It's very dense, tiny font, lots of pictures, many of which are today pretty easy to find on the web, so they're not as exciting. But this diagram, the diagrams in the book in particular, are really interesting. And so this one in particular, I spent a lot of time looking at and thinking about. As you'll recognize, it's the Fat Man bomb, the bomb dropped on Nagasaki. And it's in a what is technically called an exploded view, right? An isometric exploded view. So it's being sort of suspended magically in space, and you can see all of its internal components, and they're labeled and things like that. And we can zoom in a little bit. It's very well executed. It's got so much detail down. You feel like you can see every little screw on this thing, and it just projects a sort of mastery of knowledge. It makes it look like this person who made this, they know what they're talking about. And it provoked a lot of questions for me, like, A, do they know what they're talking about? Is this real? How much of this is known information, and how much of this is speculation? Because obviously there's still quite a lot that's classified about the design of even the very first nuclear weapons. How much of this is based in reality, and how much of this is based on extrapolation, and how much of this is maybe just speculation? So that's one question. The other question is, if this is based in reality, at what point did this information become known? Can you trace any little component on here and say, oh, this became something known in 19 something something? Because it definitely wasn't known in 1945. This would have been enough information to send you to the electric chair in 1945 if you were publishing this in a newspaper or magazine or book. And so clearly at one point, this information was considered one of the top secrets in the country. And now it's, able to be printed in a book, no problem, things like that. So this is what sort of started me on this question. And both as a question for sort of epistemology, which as a historian of science, we're obsessed with epistemology. How do you know what you know? How do we know if this is true? Since the people making these and most of the people reading them, including me, do not have access to nuclear weapons design information. We do not have access to classified information. So how do you know what's actually there? And then also, is there a history to what is known? And why would you release one bit of information at one point in time, but not release it at another, and things like that? And so this led me down the path. And in this particular example, it turns out that Chuck Hansen, who did a lot of this kind of stuff for a living before he passed away, he collected papers of all of the information he acquired, and they're at the National Security Archive at George Washington University in Washington, D.C. And he collected, you can see that it's a sort of pastiche of all sorts of other little diagrams that he's seen and information that he's passing on to an artist to make this. He was not an artist himself. And so that by itself is kind of interesting. You can actually trace out a sort of visual genealogy of this image. What is this image a combination of, which as an aside is really common in images of secret things or supposedly secret things, because you don't have an original to refer to. It's not like Chuck Hansen can go and like pull out the blueprint for the Nagasaki bomb. That's still classified. But he can look at all of these other speculative drawings and say, well, this one seems a little right about here, and this one seems right about this part. This is a really interesting way to depict it, but it's not correct, things like that. And then he sort of pulled together this information, made a little crude version of it himself. He was not an artist, but this is, gets the point across of what he's looking for. He handed it off to an artist. And I'll come back to him in a minute, this artist, but who then drew it up like this, and that became the book. So this is the kind of stuff I got me interested in this topic. Being aware that there is a history of secrecy itself was sort of the biggest, I want to say, cognitive leap for me, because obviously everybody who talks about nuclear weapons or reads about them, they know about that there's a lot of secrecy. That's well known. That's been literally part of the narrative of nuclear weapons since 1945, when they became part of our sort of public discussion. The idea of the Manhattan Project as the best kept secret of the war, that was a line put out by the Manhattan Project to sort of congratulate themselves and things like that, and also to build up this sort of aura around it. But the fact that the secrecy has a history, that it didn't just come out of nowhere, it isn't necessarily natural, it goes through phases. There are times in which the emphasis has changed. That's the part that nobody had really written that much on before, and that's what sort of sent me on this path. Now, if you start peeling away the genealogy of this particular image, just to give you some ideas about how the book works in terms of what it's looking at and things, you would end up starting with what's called the Smythe Report. Many of you have probably heard of this. It actually has this sort of terrible long name, atomic energy. Even atomic energy for military purposes is a better name than the actual name. The name was like a report on the development of the atomic bomb under the auspices of the United States government, just a mouthful of a name. And it's by Henry DeWolf Smythe. He was the chair of the Princeton Physics Department. And as you can see from the title, this is the Princeton University Press edition of it, which was printed shortly after the original run was totally depleted. It was written at the request of Major General Leslie Groves, the head of the Manhattan Project. And the Smythe Report is the sort of beginning of sort of deeper public knowledge of nuclear weapons. You have, is part of what was called the publicity campaign of the Manhattan Project, where they had, starting in about late 1944, started to worry about what are we going to say once we have this weapon ready to use, once we actually use it. They really worried that if you just used the bomb and didn't have a very coordinated public relations campaign to go with it, that this would result in people panicking. This would result in possibly disbelief. This would result in leakage of information. If people didn't have guidelines about what they could or couldn't say, newspaper reporters are going to be obsessed with learning what had happened. And there was too many people involved in this project for them to sort of police every single one of them effectively. And one of the remedies of this was the creation of this report, which is the first technical history of the Manhattan Project, and was developed during the Manhattan Project by one of its participants. And it's a very remarkable document. It has two introductions, which I really love. One is by Groves and one is by Smythe. In Smythe's introduction, he basically says, the reason for this kind of report is because we live in a democratic society and we need the world to understand what this weapon is. Because if you don't understand what it is, you're going to make really bad policy. If you think this weapon is something that can be just known with a single formula, for example, you're going to possibly go down the wrong path. Whereas if you understand what goes into making it, you might imagine how you would, say, control this weapon and this research on a national or international scale, things like that. So he believes there's a real policy component to people knowing this information. On the other hand, you have Groves's introduction, which basically says, look, anything in this book you can talk about. If it's not in this book and you've been somehow connected to this project, don't talk about it. This book is serving as what we would now call like a declassification guide. It's the limits of what you can say. And that's a really interesting dual use of this information. They are releasing information in order to control information. So that's already pretty interesting. Now, the Smythe Report has almost nothing in it on weapons design. That's deliberate. That was something they still considered to be pretty high level secret at the time. It has a lot of sort of large scale administrative decisions made, and it has anything in it, and this was sort of the first guidelines they came up with what you could release. It has anything that is in their mind was something that a small team of scientists could figure out, knowing what was published before the war, before the Manhattan Project even began, and also knowing that the atomic bombs worked. And if you have those two pieces of information, you can extrapolate a lot backwards about what the United States probably did. And so anything that was at that level, they put in the report. Anything that would require a lot of research to learn, they kept out of the report. So this is sort of the first attempt at a declassification system. It's a one-time release, but and so it's not like an ongoing event, but it's a start. It has almost nothing on weapons design. It implies that you can shoot one piece of fissile material into another because it considers that somewhat obvious, but it doesn't even say that that's what they did. It says nothing about the type of the design of the Fat Man bomb, which is probably everybody on here knows was a different design, an implosion design, much more complicated. So how did implosion design, how do you get from it's not released to it being released? Well, it turns out that it's, arrow isn't supposed to be there. It was in 1950, so 5 years later, it was discovered that Klaus Fuchs, a participant on the project, had been a spy on it. This led to the arrest of David Greenglass, who confessed to being a spy, who was the chief witness in the Rosenberg trial. His brother-in-law was Julius Rosenberg. And one of the things evidence he gave in the trial was information about the secrets that he passed on, which is to say the implosion bomb. So this was released in 1951 to the public. It was then immediately impounded. It's a whole complicated story, but reporters were allowed to see it and everybody saw it as evidence against the Rosenberg. So this is when implosion becomes declassified, the sort of core technology of the Fat Man bomb. Why did they do this? Did Greenglass himself just decided to do this? No, this was authorized by the Atomic Energy Commission, the government body that had taken over from the Manhattan Project, because they felt that by this point, the Soviet Union had already set off an implosion bomb, from what they could tell. They didn't think the secret was really worth keeping. And if you were going to release it, you might as well get some good out of it, which is to say, use it to convict these spies and maybe scare other spies to, not spy anymore. And so this is when this information comes out. And I just thought this was just fascinating. It's a declassification action, not for the good of the public or for, because it's time. It's really a declassification action so that they can get the legal result they want. And you're not allowed to use secret evidence in criminal trials in the United States. And so if you wanted to use this evidence against them, you'd have to put it out there. As I mentioned, it does get impounded. It's a complicated story about why, but the reporters were allowed to see it. They were told by the judge that they should use their discretion and not talk about it too widely because that could endanger national security. So of course it was on the front page of newspapers the next day, atom bomb secret described in court, and they describe exactly how it worked. And Greenglass's diagram is very crude and some fairly incomplete in many ways. Greenglass did not have deep knowledge of how the bomb worked, but it was enough to sort of get that information out there. One other little aside, and I could go through other parts of the bomb that in detail, but I just want to sort of illustrate the dynamics of this. When did we know what the casings looked like? That was not declassified in 1945 because the casings of these weapons give away information about how they work and information that was considered to be classified at the time. And it turns out that they were not released until 1960. The first photographs of Little Boy and Fat Man. And it's kind of remarkable to me. It's quite a bit of time for just the casing. The state of nuclear weapons had advanced considerably by 1960, and yet these still early versions were considered secret until then. And some of the correspondence about this and some of the records are actually quite interesting because they basically, the Atomic Energy Commission says, yeah, we don't really have any reason to keep these secret anymore, but every time we were going to release them, something would happen and we didn't want to make a big deal out of it. And so we wanted to time it right. So they picked what they thought was a pretty dull period to do it. And even then they got criticized because it was basically around the 15th anniversary of the atomic bombings. And so the Japanese were unhappy and things like this. But this is some little glimpse inside how these decisions are made. And that's also one of the things I think the book does a good job of, if I can say it. One of the main goals of the book is to illustrate not only how these shifts occur, but who's doing them and what they're thinking and what kind of internal dissent there is, because it appears monolithic to those of us outside the fence of secrecy. Secrecy feels like this massive imposition and a wall, and choices are made and we never see why and we don't get the rationale. But enough time has passed that many of the rationale discussions have been declassified themselves, and we can go back and see, oh, this is what they were thinking. Oh, this is what the dissenters said. Oh, this is what the advocates said. Here's the compromise they came to. There's a lot of that in the book. And just as an aside, just to go full circle with this little diagram, just after these photographs of the casing were released, people, notably Newsweek here, started to superimpose what they thought about the design information on the casing, creating these kind of composite diagrams for the first time that are the obvious sort of predecessor to something like this. One other thing I just want to note about this, I actually tracked down the artist of this, a guy named Mike Wagner. You can see his name in the lower right corner. And he was very, he was a little paranoid when I called him up. You know, are you the guy who drew these nuclear weapons diagrams? Who wants to know? It was along those lines for a little bit of the conversation, but he did eventually tell me quite a lot. He was he had mechanical drafting skills. He did a lot of work on drawing for airplane hobbyist magazines, things like that, model magazines. So he knew how to make these kinds of realistic looking three-dimensional diagrams. And he told me that the way in which he made it look the way he did is he took all this information from Hansen, and then he drew this just blown up on a huge scale and then had it reduced down. So you get that really fine grained texture, that sort of hyper fine appearance. And the line he used for me when I asked him, how real is this? He said that the way in which he drew it, quote, advertised an accuracy that these drawings do not have. And I thought that was a really succinct way of answering my question about how much of this is real and how much of this is not. This is drawn to look like it has mastery, but as the artist would himself admit, it is made to look like it has more mastery than it actually has. There's other ways you can draw a diagram like this. Again, even just this one from Newsweek is a good indication. The Newsweek diagram does not really look like it has any mastery. The one at the top in particular doesn't, but the one at the bottom doesn't either. It doesn't have the pretense of looking like an engineering diagram because it's made for a different purpose. It's made to sort of, I don't know, entertain a broad public to a degree and inform, arguably. Whereas this is made to sort of advertise, this book is the book that has the secrets. And that just gets at one other aspect of the book. The secrecy is not just something that exists within the government. It colors all of the discussion about nuclear weapons in lots of different ways. In one direction, it makes people very uncomfortable talking about them. Even people who aren't afraid of the men in black coming and taking them away sometimes self-censor themselves, or will say, well, I don't know enough about, you know, there's too much unknown about this topic for me to get into. How could I have an informed opinion? The other direction is people who sort of seek that secrecy. They like it because the secrecy is tied to power for them. And if you sort of surround yourself with the illusions and the trappings of secrecy, then you look like you've scraped off a little bit of the power from the nuclear weapons. And that's sort of what this kind of diagram is the ultimate example of. This is a guy saying, look, I figured it all out. I am now powerful. And Hansen was not the only one to do this. There's a whole community of what I call secret seekers who do this sometimes for psychological reasons, sometimes for political reasons, but there's a whole bunch of them. All right, that's a sort of overview. Let me just summarize what the book covers, and then we can go into the Q&A. I don't want to keep talking and talking. The book is broken into three main parts. Part one is what I call the birth of nuclear secrecy, and covers the period from the discovery of nuclear fission in 1939 through the Manhattan Project and use of the bombs and release of information of bombs in 1945. And there's a little bit of prehistory work in there. There's a little discussion about secrecy in the United States in general, which you start to really see the first laws that encompass that in the period of World War I, what changes by 1939, also looking at the history of physics in this period and how do you get to the bomb, things like that are in here as well. The first sort of person we credit with creating a nuclear secrecy attempt is Leo Szilard, whose story is fairly famous, but I'll just gloss over it here for those who say don't know of it. But Leo Szilard, Hungarian physicist who had fled Europe after the Nazis came to power. He is the one who came up first with the idea of a nuclear chain reaction, a neutron-based chain reaction. And then once he saw nuclear fission as a sort of driver of that reaction, he immediately started thinking about atomic bombs. And his impulse was to encourage other scientists to not publish on this, because he did not want to draw attention to the possibility to the Germans, who definitely knew about nuclear fission since they basically discovered it. And he was desperately afraid, as only a refugee of Jewish descent can, of Hitler having nuclear weapons. And he had some modest success in getting, I actually think a fairly impressive amount of success given the context of getting other scientists on board with this regime not to publish. But then the regime fell apart because he couldn't get the French scientists on board, and they published on this Frédéric Joliot-Curie and all that. He then, after that sort of setback, ends up, as most people know, going to his friend Albert Einstein and writing to the government and sort of getting some official interest in researching whether nuclear weapons are an issue. Eventually, that ends up in the hands of the organizations run by Vannevar Bush, who was the head of the Office of Scientific Research and Development. As the government became more and more convinced that nuclear weapons might be a possibility, both for them and for the Germans. So around the early 1940s, 1941, 1942, they started imposing more secrecy on it. So whereas the LARD is a sort of self-censorship where it's scientists, in a sense, voluntarily agreeing not to publish, and not always 100% voluntarily. It gets a little complicated, but close enough. Bush is using sort of regulatory powers to say, no, we're not going to publish on this, and only people with clearances are going to have access to this, and we're going to keep track of what work is done. And they're starting to do more of what we think of as a formal secrecy regime. This is still being run entirely by civilians. Bush is an engineer, but eventually Bush gets permission from Roosevelt to accelerate the project into a bomb developing project, which is to say the Manhattan Project that we know of. This means it gets turned over to the Army. This means that the secrecy increases in amount by a significant amount. All of the practices of secrecy were sort of already in place under Bush and the people he worked with, but Groves and the Army Corps of Engineers, they sort of accelerate all of these. They grow them dramatically. And if there's any one policy that gets associated with this, it's compartmentalization. Groves believed that you really needed to only let scientists know the minimum amount that they could needed to know to do their work, not only because that would, in principle, prevent espionage and leaks and sabotage and things like that, but also because it would keep the scientists well regulated. For Groves, he's very explicit that secrecy and especially compartmentalization, it's about keeping the scientists, having them stick to their knitting, as he would put it. He also, just as an aside, I'll throw this out there, obviously the main principle was to keep the Germans and later the Japanese from knowing about the atomic bomb, and then also in a way the Soviet Union and other nations in general to preserve an American advantage. But one of the things that I was kind of surprised to discover, and is I think very telling, is that one of the major reasons for the secrecy for both Vannevar Bush and Leslie Groves was a fear that Congress would learn about the weapons development. And there was a fear that the congressmen would not be accepting of this project and would want more oversight and would potentially leak all of it and potentially shut it down. And I think that's an interesting sort of different use of secrecy than we typically think of. It's not only the sort of enemies on the outside, it's also the possibility that your own democratic governance could prevent the success of this program. And whether we approve of the result of the program or not, they were very explicit. This was not to be sort of democratically decided thing. Part 2 looks at the development of the Cold War secrecy regime, talks a bit about the sort of post-war period initially. How do you transition from all of that secrecy to something else? One is, I mentioned the Smythe Report. That was one part of their publicity campaign, this sort of deliberate attempt to sort of bombard the world with information about the Manhattan Project so that they wouldn't go searching for more information. That's a sort of one-time release. It is not a system. It is not a living set of decisions being made. That comes a little bit later. J. Robert Oppenheimer, obviously famous in your part of the world, very well, very extremely. But he also lesser known is that he's the author of the modern declassification system. Groves went to him in 1945 after the war had ended and said, we need some kind of system in place so that it's not just an ad hoc affair about what gets released and what doesn't. And he and several other scientists, about 7, got together and came up with what we now have as a declassification system, where you have a bunch of experts create guides, and then these guides are interpreted by reviewers to go over documents and decide what can be released and what can't, and a whole system for doing this. And the Manhattan Project picked this up. And then when the Atomic Energy Commission got created, they picked it up. And then it got exported to the rest of the federal government. And I think that that's kind of a remarkable and fairly unknown bit of this history. Our entire modern secrecy system, it's not 100% derived from the Manhattan Project, but the Manhattan Project had a huge influence on how secrecy in general worked in the United States afterwards. There's also attempts at controlling the bomb, both domestically and internationally, that are happening in this period. Big fight over the Atomic Energy Act. What should secrecy be in this country going forward? I won't go into all the details here, but the final version of that act created this concept of restricted data, the title of the book, but as probably many of you know, is a unique legal category for nuclear secrets under American law. So in the United States, there's basically 2 categories of secrecy: national defense information, which is top secret, secret. That's all the State Department, CIA, whatever, all of that stuff, Department of Defense. And then you have nuclear technology, which is under restricted data. And it's a different but parallel system that overlaps in interesting ways. So you can be restricted data and top secret, requires 2 clearances. It's a reflection of how afraid they were of these secrets that they created this entirely different category that's defined differently. Restricted data is inherent to the content of the secret. It is not based on the authority of a classifier. It is based on the fact that it's related to nuclear technology that makes it restricted data, unless the Atomic Energy Commission removed it from that category. This was a whole complicated setup. I can talk about it in the Q&A if you're interested. But this is sort of transitioning from a period in which scientists initially are pushing for much more release of information. Most of those scientists and even administrators working on the Manhattan Project thought that secrecy would be temporary. And then it's transitioning into something that is not temporary and is actually quite expansive. Also look at the early Atomic Energy Commission in a lot of detail. Head of the Atomic Energy Commission was David Lilienthal. Lilienthal is a real liberal Tennessee Valley Authority, Roosevelt New Dealer type. He really doesn't like secrecy. He's very suspicious of it. He goes in wanting to reform the whole system, and he fails. And I'm really interested in the struggles he had in trying to make sense of what secrecy ought to be, as somebody who's quite skeptical when he starts off of the military and things like that, but is in a politically difficult situation. And it turns out secrecy is part of the currency of that politics. The secrecy makes him and his organization a lot weaker than you might think it would. There's a little bit of irony here. We think of secrecy as something organizations do to make themselves powerful, and there is that degree, that does happen to a degree. On the other hand, they were so vulnerable to leaks or accidents. If any sort of information got out that wasn't supposed to, their feet would be held to the fire and Congress would be very mad at them. And so in this way, the secrecy became a very damaging force for these organizations. And ironically, Lilienthal's period is pretty much the most secret period of the post-war for these political reasons. He did try to reform, and he had people in the AAC trying to come up with what they thought of as a more rational and sensible and less sort of overwrought secrecy policy. But this failed. Basically, the 3 combinations of things in 1949, 1950 doomed it. One was the detonation of the first Soviet bomb, Joe 1. The second was the debate over the H-bomb, which started in secret and then leaked out through very ridiculous circumstances, and sort of emphasized that there were sort of secrets to be kept, even though they didn't know them at that point. And then the revelation just a few days after Truman announced that they were going to pursue the H-bomb, that the Manhattan Project had been penetrated by Klaus Fuchs, as I mentioned before, which sort of made them feel like victims. They had lost the secrets and they were now in a much more desperate race. And all of that ends sort of ends up just killing reform efforts. They're just dead in the water. The goal at this point is to sort of make it as hard as possible for more information to get out. It's sort of the beginning of what we think of as a Cold War secrecy regime. I spent a lot of time talking about what the Cold War secrecy regime is. The one thing I would like to highlight, we all associate it not incorrectly with McCarthyism, Oppenheimer's loss of his security clearance, this sort of oppressive fear of secrets and spies and Soviets and things like that. But it was also under Eisenhower, the rise of atoms for peace, the attempt to make a civilian atomic nuclear industry, nuclear power, things like that. And there's a lot of sort of paradoxical aspects to it, where in the end, the Cold War way of looking at it is that either a given bit of information or technology is so dangerous that you could literally be executed for giving it to the wrong people, or it's so safe and good for the world that it really ought to be broadcast on all channels to everybody and released, and everybody should get in on it, and we want private industry on it, and we'd like other countries in on it, and things like this. And this was Eisenhower's attempt to sort of redeem the atom in a way. And it produced all sorts of paradoxes and difficulties and contradictions that would eventually come up. And so the last part of the book is talking about how this doesn't really work in practice, how there are lots of technologies and events that sort of skirt around and even defy this approach. One of them are things like the development of technologies that are sort of semi outside of the American government's ability to control. So gas centrifuges in particular, which are developed originally in the Soviet Union and then exported by scientists who are allowed to leave the Soviet Union. I spent a lot of time talking about laser fusion, which is a really fascinating case of a private attempt to sort of commercialize thermonuclear weapon technology in the United States. And under a previous regime in the 50s or even the 40s, if a company in the United States had tried to do something like that, they would have been sort of shut down immediately. In the United States, by the 1970s, there's now an impetus to sort of push back, and that catches the government by a lot of surprise. There's also new threats that emerge. Nuclear terrorism emerges as a threat. And the argument that is used by the people who fear it is that essentially all of that release under Atoms for Peace, that has led to a situation in which now information about making very basic weapons is actually out there. And so it's and all of the proliferation of civilian nuclear technology has meant that there's more highly enriched uranium in non-secure hands and things like this. And so this is deliberately meant to be a sort of anti-secrecy argument in favor of not trying to use information to control nuclear weapons or having any faith that it does, but to instead focus in on the material aspects, which is also what the international control people said in the 1940s. And then you also get sort of public challenges in which activists and journalists by the late 1970s, after Watergate, Vietnam, Pentagon Papers, things like that, deliberately are seeing secrecy as the thing that is the ill unto itself. This is what I call the development of an anti-secrecy ideology. And one of the cases I spent a lot of time on is the Progressive case of 1979, in which an activist and a sort of left-wing magazine bait the government into censoring them, and then essentially beat the government in court and say, you don't have the right to censor us. It's more legally complicated than that. The government declares moot. Anyway, no judgment is made. And this catches the American government completely by surprise. They really believe that people would respect the idea that nuclear weapons of all things should be kept secret. By the 1970s, that is not the case. And we sort of live in this world of anti-secrecy these days, where everything we're suspicious of. We do believe that secrecy is used to cover up ills or just used foolishly or things like that. And that sort of rejection of the paternalistic approach to secrecy that rises over the 70s and sort of merges into a sort of continued Cold War model that we have today. And then lastly, in the conclusion, I talk about the end of the Cold War, and people once again try to reform nuclear secrecy. There's an attempt by the DOE to launch the Openness Initiative. Many of you probably know about this. It has some successes and some failures eventually. And then there comes in new fears, new threats that seem to reinforce the old mindsets, notably fear of China in particular. And also in the very end, the conclusion, I talk about what does it mean to be in a world where information is so fluid? How does that change your ability to control information? Um, uh, Talk about what implications I think this study has to other fields such as biology and computer science. And then also talking about this weird era we live in where on the one hand, our state still embraces a huge amount of secrecy, especially military and weapons secrecy. On the other hand, we also, as a populace, are very suspicious of secrecy and frequently want it to be undone, and even the government occasionally goes along with that. And so this is our sort of weird state where we have commitments to two different goals and have a very hard time finding ways to resolve them and make them compatible. Okay, last thing I want to say, what are my arguments in a nutshell about this book? Big argument is that nuclear secrecy can be historicized and periodized. It's not static, it's not one thing. It's not natural. It's the product of decisions made by human beings, many of whom are flawed, of course. And they're trying to find ways through a very complicated situation, both complicated in terms of it's a world with nuclear weapons in it, but it's also politically complicated. It's a world not only with nuclear weapons, but also with, at times, Nazis, Soviets, oppositional political parties who will destroy you at the slightest scandal, things like that. It's always been controversial in the United States. There was never a period in which everybody was on board with this, including the people behind the fences. It has always been. It isn't the case that, oh, in the 40s and 50s, they were much more loyal and it wasn't a problem. No, it's not the case. They were always controversial. And some of the biggest enemies of secrecy were some of the people who worked on the Manhattan Project. Ultimately, Leo Szilard became one of the biggest enemies of secrecy, in part because he felt that it was getting out of the control of anybody like himself. Nuclear secrecy in the United States has always been about release as well as retention. This is what Lilienthal called information control. It's not just about holding things back. The act of what we might think of as the censor is not just crossing things out. It's deciding what not to cross out. And that might seem obvious to people who have worked in these systems or done this, but often our discourse is almost 100% about holding things back, not about the ability to let it go again. And if you peel back the sort of archival layers, you start to see these discussions in which people try to figure out exactly when and why you might release things. And sometimes releasing things can be just as political an act as holding them back, as in the case of the Rosenberg trial. So the book tries to draw attention to these kinds of dynamics. It's always in tension in the United States with core American governmental and cultural values and priorities. We always in the United States do not live up to all of our ideals and the Constitution and the Enlightenment, all that kind of stuff, but they're there nonetheless. And in the United States, there's always been a sort of hostile atmosphere to secrecy. It is not a country that is sort of built on secrecy. There was very little secrecy in the 18th century, at least of the kind that we think of in the modern period. Secrecy as we think of it today is mostly a 20th century invention. And so this tension makes it really interesting. It makes the United States a great country to study for this in a way that, not saying that it wouldn't be interesting to study the Soviet Union in secrecy, but secrecy is the norm in the Soviet Union. It is not the norm in the United States, though it becomes a much larger factor over time. These tensions produce really interesting things. I call them sort of monsters in a sort of pre-Enlightenment mode, but they're like edge cases. They're bizarre activities, they're fears, they're things that don't make a lot of sense on the face of them, but are created by these tensions. And so somebody like Chuck Hansen, who is like drawing these elaborate weapons to proclaim that he has the mastery over them, that's the kind of weird thing that happens in the United States mostly. It does not happen in a lot of other countries where you can have that sort of freedom to say that you're releasing secrets, right? That's a very strange creation, and I'm really drawn to those. It's not clear at all that nuclear secrecy has appreciably affected the history of proliferation in a positive way. It is not clear that denial of information has slowed down or stopped any country from acquiring nuclear weapons. It's very hard to make that argument that it hasn't. It's very hard to have evidence of well, if we had released all this information, would they have been faster? We don't really know. You know, these are counterfactuals, but it's certainly not obvious. It is very clear, on the contrary, that secrecy, especially nuclear secrecy, has had a negative impact on trust in government and a public participation in nuclear policy. This book is not an activist book. It is not against secrecy per se, but I do think that these are interesting things to think about as we think about what it ought to be like. The fact that it's not clear that this stuff has been that effective, though it is clear that there have been a lot of negative side effects of it. And different people are going to read that different ways. And lastly, there's probably no simple remedy to the situation if you think that nuclear secrecy should be gotten rid of or something like that. The politics of anti-secrecy, of just being suspicious and positional to secrecy, they never have created a sort of culturally viable alternative. You need something bigger than just a rejection. You need the embrace of an alternative. The closest we have to those are some of the attempts at international control, in which you have people basically saying secrecy is not the way in which we control nuclear weapons. It's controlling access to materials and the building of factories and things like that, not information. And even that has never been culturally powerful enough to be as effective as the people who wanted it would like it. Anyway, that's my book. I've talked a little bit more than I want to. I'm really pleased that you